All right, hey everybody. Nice to meet you, and thanks for joining our little presentation here. You might hear my buddy Blau here in the background. Whenever he hears me speaking, he kind of wants to chime in, but he's going to calm down. Anyways, so let's start talking about art directing, physical simulation or physics-based simulation in visual effects for movies and TV shows, and also game cinematics, commercials, what have you. Yeah, so let me just start this here. By the way, I had no idea there was an option to pre-record this, so I'll just do it live. So, excuse my mistakes on the way. Okay, so first of all, who am I? My name is Goran Pavles. I'm a visual effects supervisor at Stoneborn Studios, and I'm originally from Switzerland, where I started my career in visual effects, basically as an effects artist. So about 20 years ago, a friend introduced me to 3ds Max, where I was first time exposed to, a 3D software, and I was just instantly mind blown and hooked. And ever since, that's just been my life. So yeah, that led me to, work at some known companies like Scanline, Pixamondo, Uncharted Territory, and working on some really cool movies on the way. And then at some point in 2017, some friends and we decided to start our own little facility called Stoneborn Studios in Vancouver. This is where I'm residing right now. And ever since, we have been focusing on fluid simulations, RBDs, rigid body dynamics, particle simulations. So really diving into that and focusing on heavy effects sequences. So that's basically what kind of the studio is known for and what it specializes. And as a small studio, especially since 2020, the COVID pandemic, we saw this uprise in streaming shows and everything. So we are getting more and more of that kind of content to work on. Okay, I think that's enough of the intro, so let's dive into the juicy stuff. But first, if you guys don't know us, here's our show reel, so you can see what kind of work we have done as a studio, not the work before. So Matt, if you want to play video one, you can do that. so that's a little bit of our work. Oh, I have to share again. Yeah, so that's a little bit about our work, what kind of stuff we do. We do also other stuff like environments and compositing and just the whole visual effects thing. But since we're talking about physics and simulations, I thought we're going to condense just the juicy stuff into this little showreel. All right, cool. So how do we art direct that stuff? How do we control it basically? And before we dive into the technical, I wanted to just kind of go back a little bit about just like movies and visual effects in general, and define what is really important, because it's kind of sometimes we get lost in simulating a lot of detail or like really focusing on one thing, and then we just plug it in and think the work is done, but it just breaks apart. And it's a really important thing to understand like an overall picture. How does it come together and what makes it really work and what actually doesn't, or where does it fall apart? So people have been doing this actually way before computers. So even before CGI existed, there was actually visual effects. It was just not computer based. It was practical elements being filmed in different perspectives and so on. And so yeah, we think of movies, when we think of movies, like actors, environments, dialogue, and emotions. But physical effects have been a really crucial part to storytelling for a long time. And yeah, let's just have a look a little bit about what kind of stuff, I just did a little clip here of things that I could find of physical effects that are really, really old, like really old. I was surprised. I think the first one I found, this one here from the 1950s. And obviously we see, it doesn't hold up clearly, but when you see it, it's like, how, it's just, and we can see how these elements sometimes work really well, like this one or this one. It just kind of, feels kind of good, and then others don't. And that's really good indicator of like for us in CGI as well. It's like to get indications of, okay, what is missing, what should we focus on, and what, like for example here, the clouds like look really good. Like actually in CGI doing clouds like that is not that easy. And even the water detail of the wave going backwards is pretty good. It's just like putting it together, that's where it starts falling apart. And that's a really good indicator. So certain giveaways I wanted to focus on, or basically in physics, it's like the first thing in general is light and color. So that is actually a physical element in an image. It's the physical element, and you have to nail that. If you don't have that right, it's going to fall apart. So, light is, temperature, mood, it tells just really a lot of stories. It integrates elements too, like one object can cast a shadow onto the elements of the other. And so on, or if you have a fire and illuminates the actor, but the fire is one element and the actor is another, you put them together. If there's no illumination between them, the image falls apart. So that's what I mean. So yeah, let's take a look at here. Another element is scale and speed. And this is not a physical simulation, but it is, to me, it is so well done. Like we can see how the Godzilla here, this is from Roland Emmerich's Godzilla, is like moving at a certain speed very slowly, and every footstep has an impact. So we feel the weight, we feel everything. It's really well done, and it's very integrated, even though we can tell that, the Godzilla is a CGI element in this image. Actually, I don't even know where the miniature or even a film plate stops and where the CGI begins. I want to say that Godzilla is like rendered, but I don't know if the environment is a miniature. It's really well done, and that's for its time. So that's something that for me is very important. So if we just replace Godzilla with anything else, these are the elements we still have to, or these are the aspects we still have to follow to make this work. Here is another one. which I love. It's a physical simulation in a spaceship. It's for the movie The Passengers, and they turned off gravity. So maybe you have seen like astronauts playing with water bubbles in space, and it looks kind of abstract. It looks weird, but they took it to another level here with an actual swimming pool. And if we forget about that, there's no like the aspect that is physically kind of unreal, that there's gravity in space and they can just turn it on with with the button. We still feel like this is a real physical thing, and we can still believe that this is actually water. And we still feel the weight and the scale of the water. So to me, it's very interesting how even when we turn off gravity, we still can feel gravity when we look at this footage, or we feel the mass of the water itself. So that's really successful here. So speed, scale, weight, interactivity, light, and color. Those are really the important things that we're looking for when we're putting things together. And here, for example, is another one which they nailed everything, but for me, except the weight. Like when this well, not meteors, but like from the caldera, from the explosion, this is from 2012, when this rocks impact, I mean, everything looks really great. Simulation, everything is perfect, but the way they impact the ground, they lose the weight. They feel like, I don't know, it's just the one aspect, and just to me, this falls a little bit apart, even though they had everything else. So again, just really important to realize that it's not always the detail, it's not always the complex simulation. It's like how the image comes together and how it makes us perceive it and feel about it. Cool. So these are kind of the abstract elements of art directing or bringing physical simulations and renders into the image and make them work with the image. Now we can, we can quickly talk about how to art direct this physical simulation itself. And I like to think about it, or basically I'd like to explain it in a way where we as humans, we see something like the water in space, and we still recognize it as water, even though it moves like nothing on Earth moves, because the gravity was turned off. We still perceive it, oh, this is water. It looks like water. It still behaves. It splashes like water. It reflects like water. So we still kind of feel it, even though it is totally unphysical in that moment to us. Obviously, we consciously understand there's no gravity, but we have never seen it. And this is kind of the movie magic. We can take physicality and totally break it, and still it feels physical. And that's where art direction and physical solving kind of splits. And it's really cool. And in an abstract way, we can think of it of guiding a simulation. So the main motion we are guiding, we are putting art direction into it. And then the simulation, the physical look, is kind of a secondary layer on top that just portrays the physicality of the element. And I like I like the analogy of we're animating a character with keyframes, and we just had that with Christian, I believe. He mentioned exactly that, which is funny. So we're animating the character, and the character it's a pretty good animation, but the cloth simulation really like amplifies the emotions, and it's a physical simulation. There's very little art direction in the physics solve, and yet we can feel she's happy, we can feel how she's light on her feet, it's a good mood. So there's like it just brings things together with simple art direction and then a guide on the physical simulation on top, like a layer. So we can take this to the next level, and same idea, but we're just replacing the cloth with water, right? And again, nobody has ever seen a water monster or a water creature, but we can feel it is water, and it is so abstract, and yet it feels physical because the weight is there, the shading and the lighting is correct, or pretty damn good. This is a Narnia, Prince Caspian, so it's quite an old movie. And yeah, it feels right. It's integrated well, even with the plate connected to the water. It has weight, so everything works well. And it is a secondary motion on top of a guided animation. All right, let's take this another step, more abstract. So here's 2012. This is actually a shot I worked on. It was one of my very first movies I worked on. And I was part of doing the ground RBDs. And here again, we have a lot of hand animation that is art directed, timings, beats, like when does what happen. So all this the ground lifting and going down, that was all hand animated. And then what we did is we basically put the RBDs as a secondary layer attached to it and reacting to it. And then again, every tree is like a cloth simulation. So again, like a dress on top. So it's guided by the animation of the ground. Then we have the freeway here on the left. It is again, to some degree, hand animated. To some degree, it's like a cage simulation or like a constraint simulation, like low res. And then on top of that comes the RBDs as a reactive simulation, portraying the physicality of the smaller debris. And then on top of that comes another layer, which is the pyroclastics, right? So everything drives, so one layer drives the next, which drives then the next layer, which is like the character and the cloth, and then again the cloth driving another cloth, and so on, in our first abstract kind of metaphor of, driving the simulations. And the same with the buildings. It's a cage simulation, low res. It kind of drives the main motion, and then we have secondary simulation on top and tertiary simulation on top of that. Cool. So that is kind of the basic idea. This is the principle. And it's really, to me, interesting because it feels physical, but, it's not a really physical simulation. It's based on physical solvers, of course. So when we talk about solvers, looking a little bit back in time, solvers are not that old. I mean, the math behind them is quite old, but the software itself is like 20, 30 years old in visual effects, at least. And around the 2000 turn, that's when the first physics simulations came in. But before that, it was mostly particles. Particles and actually manually, like tweaking shaders and textures and combining those things. And it was very, very technically creative because there was, physics solvers weren't really a thing, and people were not, like, I'm not a programmer. I couldn't write a solver. I don't have that math background. So we kind of just like, okay, what do we need to do? We have particle sprays and we can give them events. Well, if you get into this region, you start falling, right? So very, very old school, simple effect. And everything had to be rendered with sprites, metaballs, or volumetric shapes, which don't reflect the light ray, but they kind of scatter into the objects. So I'll just play those two. And the left side, we have Deep Impact, I think 1999 or somewhere there. And on the right, we have Day After Tomorrow, 2005, roughly there. And some part of the same team. I mean, the guys that did the water, they were, I think some of them were on the same, on both movies. And quite a big jump. And on the left, we have this kind of like pre-solver era, or just about to enter. There were some shots that are have been like using first Navier-Stokes equations. Sorry, blanking here. And on the right, it's like, okay, then they took it to the next level, and it became like the new thing in movies. And we can see a huge difference in the look. And it's just interesting to see, okay, before we had this like pure art direction. And then on the right, we had like the combination between physical simulation and art direction. Cool. So next, I was thinking like we worked on the Penguin as our last kind of or most recent very successful project that we won an Emmy for and the VES award, among other parts, team members of on the movie and TV show. And yeah, so I was thinking to give you a little bit of a deeper dive in how this is done technically, and it's an overall thing. It's not purely physics simulations, but because it has quite some heavy effects in there, we're going to dive into that as well. And just before we start, I'd like to give you a heads up. There's going to be a lot of spoilers. So if you really want to see this show and you don't want to get a spoiler, you need to make a decision now. All right. So quick info about the show itself. So The Penguin is a spin-off of The Batman, the latest Batman movie, in which the Riddler was the main villain. And he injects chaos into the city by placing multiple bombs along a seawall that goes through Gotham City. And then these bombs cause flooding inside the city. So our show is a continuation of the movie, so it connects right back to it, and it is about the Penguin, who is the new villain, and it displays his uprising. So his name is Oswald Cobb, and his uprising in Gotham City after the Batman movie. And in this specific episode that we worked on, we are seeing these bombs and this terrorist attack from the perspective of one of the TV show's protagonists, who watches, or basically through his perspective, of how that flooding happens in the city and how that affects his life. All right, so let's dive in. Actually, Matt, you want to play the second video?
You remember where we came from? We have more than enough.
I gotta go.
What about dinner?
Invite her here. We have a lot of food.
No. I'll leave later on.
The guy that hops the girl, right?
Is it working?
Just starting. Those bombs.
God, they're everywhere.
Am I back? Yeah. Okay. So yeah, this was a little short clip of the entire episode, and this is kind of condensed a little bit together about to show our shots. So yeah. So we had 35 shots on this project, and we were responsible for 2 sequences that give insight into Victor's past. Victor is the young guy watching the whole thing from the rooftop. So while the big flood scene stands out, there were 35 shots around it that required visual effects. The kitchen sequence, where we see him and his family, we had to build the world outside of the windows. We had to see the freeway in the back that connects that story to the rooftop scene, so we understand that the flood is actually killing his family. Okay, and yeah, we'll just focus on the water simulations here, basically the whole effect simulations. Okay, so to start, let's take a look at the final result again and then break it down. So just of the flood sequence. So in the edit, it was cut as multiple shots, but internally we were working on it as one continuous long shot. And that gave us some advantages, but it also created complex effects dependencies, which I'll guide you through. Okay. So the reason why it was a single shot is due to how it all started. So when the client approached us, all there was the concept that we see on the left here. Everything else in the sequence grew out of that then. So initially there was a plate, so they recorded from a rooftop how the flood would move, but obviously they couldn't know the speed and what would make sense. So it was like, they would just have to film an empty street, and then kind of we would have to squeeze in the flood and make it work for the camera. And that was just putting too many constraints on that sequence. And so the idea emerged that we should create a pre-visualization of a plausible flood that makes sense, and then from there design the shot, or as it turned out in our case, an actual sequence. So basically we could then animate the camera like somebody watching the event in real life and let the flood guide the camera. Okay, so here's how that looks like very low res, very, kind of rough, but it also gives us information about timing, how the seawall breaks and everything. So we were contemplating on how the physics of the events could channel the water in a way that it generates a high flood with enough energy to take out Victor's family in the apartment on the 3rd floor on the other side of the block. So again, art directing the flood and making it plausible physically to tell a story with the physics. So the idea was that when the seawall cracks from the explosion, it opens up like saloon doors. Remember the old saloon, kind of Western-style saloon doors that open in both sides, and then that would lean on the freeway, and the weight of the water pushing behind that would tip over the freeway and wedge it against the buildings, creating kind of a funnel shape. So that would basically lead all the water into our street and give that high energy water that keeps its height and hits the apartment with a lot of strength. So now with that visible flood in place, the creative process of designing the shot and the camera move was actually possible. All right, so quickly moving on to the CG work itself, it can be split in 2 categories. So building the world that everything happens in, and then once we have that, design the dynamic elements. So quickly to building the world itself, the street level, including storefronts, people's cars, and the road were all CG, as well as the seawall and the freeway. The main buildings of the street were projected set photography onto Simple Geo inside of Nuke, so compositing software. And then additionally, matte paintings or DMPs were used to slightly change or add to the existing buildings. So basically stitch it all together, add interactive lighting and so on. And then as the sequence grew beyond the flood shot, we generated an environment covering 270 degrees of Gotham City skyline. So we could follow the actors that were shot on blue screen reacting to emotions around them. I had a pop-up here on the screen. All right, so now that we have a 3D world, we can look into the dynamics. So the shot was packed with effects that consisted of explosion and the dust, the rigid body dynamics of the seawall and the freeway, all the water effects, crowds running, tripping, and drowning, cars crashing on the freeway and falling into the water, floating cars and debris inside the water. And finally, some smaller effects like shaking light poles, awnings getting ripped off, swinging traffic lights, and so on. So just to kind of give it that final touch. So when we face with the shot with that many elements, like it's really overwhelming at first. So the effects elements have to interact with each other, which creates quite a few dependencies. So this map gives you a little bit of an idea of the complexity of those dependencies. So if we look at the white water in the bottom right, it is affected by 4 different elements, and each of those have their own influences. So if you change one, you might have to change the next, and then after that, the next one. So let's start with the explosion that triggers everything. So as Victor pulls himself up to look over the balcony, he witnesses the event already in play. And to keep the explosion alive long enough for when we and Victor look over the balcony, we developed a system to retain the temperature post-simulation for much longer. So we don't just look at the remaining smoke, we actually still see the explosion, kind of, the fireball rising up. So again, we're breaking physics with art direction to kind of tell our story or increase our storytelling, and it still feels physical. And then we layered a lot of dust, smoke, and trail sims for a more complex look. All the volumes were rendered with all the street and sea walls and car lights to generate accurate light scattering inside the volumes. And the explosion was rendered from multiple angles, so we could also use those in other adjacent shots. So next to the RBDs, we always like to first find key characteristics in references for our effects. So for the freeway, we noticed that there is quite a bit of bending and folding happening in real life examples. So it behaves a little bit like a carpet. Also, check out how the seams create unusually straight fracture lines seen in the pictures on the right. So with this reference in mind, we also needed to portray the physicality of the domino effect described earlier, the water pushing the seawall pushing and leaning on the freeway, causing it to break. So to achieve that, we used animation controllers, the yellow boxes that guide the RBD simulation. And then once that main motion was set, secondary simulations with more detailed fragments were layered on top, and then metal structures, rebars, freeway signs, etc. was added into it. And those were then run through a vellum cloth simulation to give them some bending and flexing motion, like we see on the freeway sign here. Did it just stop playing? Well, anyways, yeah. So next, the water effects consisted of 5 main components. So the base water, the big splash in the end, the detailed sims and splashes, and white water, and then the mist on top. So again, reference footage gave us insight on scale and level of detail. Breaking waves demonstrated how mist behaves on fast-moving bodies of water, and impacting waves and ice calving guided the look for the splashes. Cool. So simulating the main body of water in a single sim wasn't feasible, as it would create long iteration times, not allow for parallel workflows, and limit us in resolution. So therefore, we split the simulation into 5 separate sections, where the 3 mid-sections were a distributed simulation, meaning there were 3 computers simulating at the same time, sharing data between each other. So after having a good flood version of the main body of water, we isolated its edges to emit more detailed high-resolution splash simulations. We also added simulations for water leaping over the seawall and the freeway. And a custom meshing system was used to mesh everything together despite different sim resolutions. So in total, we had 19 flip simulations. All right, so the white water was done with the custom setup and wedged in 40 different simulations. Multiple settings for ballistic spray were combined for a more complex splash look. And then sourcing was triggered by car collisions, surface curvature, speed, vorticity, and airborne water. And then the mist consisted of 2 elements, one generic filler mist, which was rendered at low densities, and then one thicker, short-living mist emitted high densities and ballistic white water. And then everything combined, everything combined created this kind of complex organic look, especially with the light scattering through. It looked really nice. So we also had to do some running and like the crowd. So we used kind of motion capture clips that we stitched together, like the running and the falling cycles. For the drowning people, we used instancing simulated ragdolls, we instance simulated ragdolls onto particles. So they're just like tumbling and fighting for life. And then we also simulated actual ragdolls colliding with the objects inside the water and trying to float on the water surface. The floating debris was simulated using a rigid body simulation where objects were fragmented and then constrained back together. Each fragment would try to lazy follow its original animation while also be pulled to the water surface. With the system, we were able to first animate cars on the freeway, so art directing them, then release them to the physics solve for the car crash scene. And where required, animation adjustment would apply post-simulation, and then we could run that whole thing again. And then in a second layer, smaller debris was added into the simulation that reacts to the bigger object inside of the water. And then finally combining all of those FX elements together created this carefully orchestrated chaos. For lighting and rendering, we use Houdini with Redshift, and rendering this nighttime scene with all the lights, volumes, and refractions posed quite a big challenge. So what we had to do is we had to reduce our render times. We had to combine common light types into mesh lights. So street lights, traffic lights, window lights, and so on. Each of them would become one light, so basically light category, so to say, single light per category. And then for the car light beams, we actually used IES lights instanced to the points where the car lights are. And then everything was rendered with global illumination, which created really nice light scattering inside the volumes. And then we had to send that to AWS for rendering because it was too heavy for our local farm. So now that we had all our CG renders, we had to do that part that I mentioned in the very beginning, is like combine that with the real plate footage, and also combine all these elements together and make them work together. So believe it or not, this actually makes things even more complex. So this is how the comp setup looked at some point, which is kind of crazy. I just wanted to show you that, even on the 2D side where you don't have complex solvers, things can get pretty damn complex. So to break out those elements, so the foreground plate of Victor, so this is the blue screen plate that was filmed. Remember, we had to animate the camera based on the flood. So this camera move didn't work anymore. So we had to split Victor from the plate, and then we had to replace the balcony and reproject it. And then Victor had to be massaged back into the newly animated camera move to not slide and still to correctly sit in the camera's perspective. And then to bring the building's projections to life, we added green screen elements of people into the windows and animated masks to simulate TV glow. As the water hits the buildings, light flicker in the apartments was added with expressions that controlled frequency and different light types. The building had 2 states to transition from lit to dark as the flood progresses and turns out the power in the buildings. Fireball interactive light was done purely in Nuke's 3D environment using simple geo and animated lights. And lastly, interactive lights from the CG cars and wet maps from the water were used to tie different elements together. And then finally, we added also some car damage, and scratches and broken windows were added in Nuke as well. And then the final touches include lens flares, schmutz, and filmed elements of mist, spray, sparks, and breaking glass to complete the shot. So we're going from the very back of all the elements in the back, all the way to the front, to the lens, the physics of the lens in the camera itself. And then we put that all together, and that kind of creates this complete picture. And just a few stats finally. So the shot generated around 70 terabytes of data, and cumulatively, if it was rendered on one machine, it would have rendered for about 2 years on the local farm and an additional 3 years on AWS. Cool. So Matt, if you want, you can play the third video, I believe. It's the breakdown, just so we summarize this work. Yeah, with a little breakdown. So you can see here all the VFX that actually went into it, and what was originally filmed in camera. Cool. Yeah, I think so. That's pretty much about it. We can do Q&A. Hope you enjoyed that.
Very cool, very, very cool. Yeah, super impressive. Thank you so much for all of the all of the inputs. I mean, it's been fantastic to go from, I don't know, history to basically the theory how of the art direction and the challenges there, and then we saw all of the different aspects and layers of physics simulations, including then also everything in compositing at the very end to give it the final look. It's a very, very good insight in how complex this stuff can be at such let's say effects heavy work as what you guys at Stormborn are doing. So kudos for that. Like, respect. It's really, really impressive, and I mean it shows that you guys know how these things are done. And so one thing, maybe I'm not perfectly sure if everybody picked up on it, but I just want to, and maybe even I didn't get it correctly, but so typically when you're shooting something for, let's say for a TV series or for a movie, so you have what's it called? I think principal photography, where you shoot the stuff on camera. That's called kind of that's production, right? The actual movie shoot on location. But so in that whole production phase, you actually pre-production would be kind of while the script is still being written, and that's before principal photography actually starts. But the thing is now, what you I may get the order slightly wrong, but I'm trying to simplify it a little bit. So typically you have previs before you start shooting everything. But the thing is now, you mentioned previs kind of almost as part of visual effects or the post-production. And it's so interesting because So what you described is you have some plates which were shot on a set, on a physical balcony behind the physical actors, but the camera doesn't, for example, know what the speed of ultimately of the wave will be. So kind of how fast does the water come, right? Including the actors, where do they look, and so on. So you needed to first basically figure the speed out, figure out the speed. Then kind of do a previs to be able to define where the camera should look, and then go back and fix the actual original plates which were already distorted and fix everything and reproject. That was actually shot, I don't know, weeks or months before, right? So there's a huge like logistical aspect in getting all of those things right. So it's complicated.
It is complicated. I mean, there is different ways to do it, and it's not just the technical limitations that you have. It's also budgetary limitations and also planning. Sometimes decisions are being made in the middle of writing. So there are movies where they actually do the previs first, then they go on set and they use the data from the previs. They can display it in the camera. Then there's volumes, there's technical solutions where you can actually film free and the 3D always updates. So it's really like who is driving the show and what kind of budgets do they have, and like at which state is the show. In our case, the client had an idea. They were still writing, but they knew, okay, this is going to be a challenge. Let's get this Stoneborn early in, and let's see what they suggest. Maybe they have a solution for us. And then we were like, through discussions, we were like, okay, well, why don't we just do this and you see how it feels like, and maybe that gives you a guide. And then again, they could have used this to, film it because it was on blue screen, but for whatever reasons in the background they couldn't use the footage in like our previs inside their camera. There's different constraints that affect that. So that's just basically how it went. And then we had to split the blue screen plate from the balcony to kind of be able to freely animate the camera. And again, because the Victor was filmed from the back, there wasn't much, we didn't have much room to move. But he doesn't have like sharp corners that really show vanishing lines and perspective. So you have a little bit of room to move around.
Yeah, but I mean that's another, let's say, compliment if the client basically says, yeah, let's bring those guys in from very early on because they can help with those decisions. I mean that's not the standard case, so it's another big compliment. Really cool.
Thanks.
I mean,
actually, there's I don't know. Do you want to play the other video in the background? So there's a second show we did very similar where the client did exactly the same. They came to us and were like, hey, how should we do this? And again, we were kind of on the fly creating previs as we were actually already going in the show, because there was so much going on that it was really difficult to design what's happening in the like in the scene, because the shot is also very long and you want to kind of react to the water as well. You don't want just the water react to you. So
which one's that?
The last one, the long video. I don't know if you have it.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah. Let me play this right at the moment here. Cool.
Yeah. So here, this is the other seawall where it's depicting the Hurricane Katrina disaster, and we had to basically, the water is going through this poor neighborhood. It's really taking houses with it. And there's like cars, and the camera is following with the flood through the street. And here we have like each house, when does it break? How does it move inside the frame? What did the trees do? And one thing that is also very difficult in this situation is like when there's so much happening and it's such a long shot, it kind of tends to get boring. It's like almost like we have all seen crazy effects. So you go back to the roots of filmmaking. It's like, what are the interesting parts in the shot? Like, what are the moments where something happens? How do you make it still interesting and the viewer still engaged? And so we had to, while we were simulating this, keep changing certain things. And obviously we were doing everything on a very low res level, but the previs or the post-vis, let's call it post-vis part, was taking really deep into the project, where the client was like, hey, can we just like add this tree and move it through frame, and then something comes from the left or from behind the camera. So this was designing the shot on the fly, and it was actually really helpful for us because we weren't just giving a constraint up front and then try to squeeze everything physical into it. It was like, no, the physics kind of helped driving and portraying the speeds that I mentioned at the beginning, like speed, weight, reactiveness. Obviously, this is now full CG, but still kind of the same rules apply.
Yeah. No, really, really cool. I'm gonna let this play a little bit, but I mean, also some of the in the theory part, you showed some of the stuff of, for example, 2012. I think the visual effects there, or at least a part of, were made, I think, by those Digital Domain back in the day, I believe.
Yes, that's right.
Because I watched these making ofs. I remember that this like at least 10 years ago. I watched them over and over again. It was so impressive. Also bringing in new technology like the bullet solver back then, which just because it's faster, they needed to be able to sim much faster. And so that was really impressive back in the day. But so there's a couple of questions that came in, but I would just have one basically. So in your experience when working with a client, so let's say if you have elements like in a flood, you have some cars which could be hand animated or they could be dragged with the simulation. You mentioned both options, like kind of guided animation and then kind of secondary, just follow something basically based on like a secondary animation. Now, how deliberately are you, let's say, staging the entire process so that if a client can come in and say, hey, I would like, can you drive this and can you drive that, so that you can actually go back and fix those things? How do you balance this with, especially with clients that may not like certain elements of a shot, but then keep the general, let's say, for example, nature of the simulation? How do you manage these things in staying flexible yet automated, kind of?
Yeah, I mean, that's the challenge, right? You basically assume that the client will want to change anything. And you kind of develop a workflow where this is always an option. And I think it's the challenge is not the technical part. The challenge is kind of reserving time for it, or basically making sure you do have the time to do it. The time constraint is, to me, a much stronger one than can we do this? Like nowadays, we have tools that really allow us to, as I said, like the car simulation. It started as a basic animation, so we would basically place the cars on the freeway, just animate them, driving on those lanes, and then we're like, okay, so what would happen? How would we kind of react as humans if suddenly the seawall on the right, like let's assume you're driving in a car and on the right, the seawall starts hitting the freeway and everything shakes up, and it's like, what do? You hit the brakes, and then what does the car behind you do? Like, so it tries to kind of swivel around you and then hits the side bank of the freeway and it flips over. So we're basically kind of creatively trying to think through the process, not just physically, but also human behavior, right? And then we animated the cars really rough to kind of do those things. One just kind of stops, then the other one behind it stops, and then the next one kind of goes around it and flips over, goes to the other side of the freeway. These guys react. And then we just like kind of trigger them when we say like, okay, now we have enough of this animation input, this art direction input. Now we just release it into the simulation and let it kind of flip over, fall off the freeway, whatever it wants to do. And then what we can do is then we take those caches, and that, you know, every car is kind of has a pivot. So we can bake out the animation. And in Houdini, you don't even really need to bake it out. It's already kind of cached. So you can just grab it and modify it. And you can just kind of imagine you take the animation path as a soft selection. So you pull it, and the time curve around it, kind of Bezier style, moves with it. So you have almost full control. And then you can just redo the process. You move it, and then you re-release it into the sim again. So you can just kind of loop this process until you're happy. And then the same works for the flood. Like, you know, you cache out the low-res flood, and then you create a state. Hey, is a car inside of the water? Then give it a buoyancy force. Otherwise, just follow the current. And if you don't like a car, you just pick it and delete it. And that's pretty much it. The one thing you will have to do is simulate certain elements, like I mentioned in the dependency kind of diagram. It's like white water is sourced by a car. So if you suddenly pick out the car, you're going to have white water source with nothing in there, and that might look strange. So you most likely will have to resimulate that white water part where this is happening. But remember, we were splitting this up into multiple sections, so you could isolate that section and only resim that part.
Yeah. Cool. All right, so let's quickly dive in some of the questions. Bela writes, "Hi Goran, thanks for the talk. I have two questions. First, why did you choose Roland Emmerich's examples at the beginning, like Godzilla and 2012? Are those your standard references for this kind of large-scale destruction work?"
I was thinking the same when I was creating it. Sorry.
There's quite some text. Are they just films you always keep close at hand, or are you preparing for FMX for the next conference? So that's the first question.
I mean, when I was young, I was very impressed by those movies. That's number one. I mean, this is what, you know, when I was shown the 3D program for the first time, and then I started diving into it, and I was like, oh my God, I connected the dots. I was like, wait, the tools that I'm using are kind of like doing exactly this. And then in the forums, I realized, some of these tools are actually being used in those movies. And I was like, you know, excited, like ecstatic. Like I was like, holy shit, I can do movies because I understand the tools. So I guess that created this connection. I did work on the 2012 movie. That was my very second movie I ever worked on. So it is. And one thing from an effects perspective, I kind of like his movies, more the older ones than the new ones, because he was pushing the boundaries. Like we've never seen effects like 2012. Up to that point, we've never seen effects like The Day After Tomorrow up to that point. So it was really like, those were milestones, visual milestones, at least for me. Now we're so spoiled with like, you know, everything. So it kind of doesn't create those memories, but those were for me like the big ones. Yeah, and there were others.
Yeah. All right, so there's a second part. When you work on a shot with that much water and physics simulation, do you have an internal checklist for judging whether it is holding up what are the first things that usually break?
Holding up in terms of resolution, or
I guess quality in general, holding up in the sense of the expectations of what you want to like achieve artistically or for the silver screen.
I think it's an iterative process. You aim high. You expect a lot of comments, and you start from the bottom, like you start low, and you work your way up until you hit the level where you're like, okay, this now looks good. And I think there's an iterative process. There's feedback. There's a lot of feedback from the client, but also internally. You need to be open to that, and just accept feedback as, oh, yeah, that might be a good point, because one thing that I see a lot of happen is tunnel vision. It happens to me a lot. It's like you spend so much time on a shot or on an effect that you kind of get familiar with it, and it starts. Your eye gets comfortable with it, even though it might not be perfect. And then oftentimes somebody from the outside comes in, and it's just like they instantly see things that you might not see. And it's this iterative process with a lot of communication back and forth, and you build a way up to the look and to the resolution.
Yeah, very cool. So I just started playing the video again because I also realized it just stopped. So Mike also wrote something, so I think we're gonna move on slowly towards the break, but let's continue a little bit more. So amazing presentation. What was the most challenging technical hurdle in this sequence, and how did you adapt the simulation pipeline to solve it? So that's in reference probably to the penguin sequence.
What was the most challenging?
Actually, he writes, my question is related to the initial bridge sequence with Vincent. Yeah. So that's for the penguin shots, basically.
Yeah. I mean, there were multiple challenges, and it all kind of came together. Like, just for example, obviously the water is quite a challenge, but that is expected, right? So you kind of mentally prepare for it. You already start planning very early. We were like, okay, can we simulate it in one? First thing we did, we simulated in one go, right? And then we're like pushing the resolution and see where it hits. And originally we had something where we're like, oh, it's not that bad. But then we looked at it and it was like, no, this is not working. And simulation times just went way overboard. And then we had to look into the splitting up, and how do you split it up? How do you distribute? Where the seams? Can you see the seams? Like, and then we moved on to the splashes, and we're like, first the splashes are looking pretty good, but then you just start realizing, there's still not enough detail. We can still squeeze out more. And so the water was obviously difficult, but to me, choreographing all the action coming together, like that is quite a challenge. Like you have all these dependencies, and we have the cars, they go from 3 different states, kind of like just driving to crash and then into the water, and it takes them all the way. And then you have all the people running, right? Like, how do the people run? Like, how do you even, you can't just simulate them running away. There's maybe Weta can do it with Massive or new tools that they have. We don't have that luxury. So it was just like, and connected, like, what if a car hits a person? Like, how do we do this? So that's when we did the mocap cycles, we stitched them like running and falling, and then we just place exactly that moment of falling just when a car kind of gets to the person. So it was really it was very choreographed and art directed in the end.
Yeah. How about, or in this context of what was complex, I mean, one thing which you mentioned briefly I thought is probably a huge challenge, and that's the whole, let's say, can it render? Does it render? You mentioned the lights. You didn't use, like, to optimize the whole render. You didn't use just standard lights, or just IES lights for the cars, but everything else was basically combined into geometry lights, into meshes which emit light. So even that, I mean, I see that this could be a huge challenge, that when you have a shot planned which renders and then you suddenly see, oh no, it doesn't render because of that, and you may need to pretty much change the entire render setup or convert certain things like matching lights to or standard lights to geometry lights and so on. That I see that this stuff could be a massive nightmare also.
Oh yeah. You're right about that. So we kind of approach it the same way that I described the water sim. It's like you start with the most simple one, and then you start hitting limits, and you start splitting it up. So we were splitting up even those car lights. We had to render it 3 times. We were just selecting, 30% of cars, render that, and just the car lights, and then 30% of other car lights, for example. So you basically, you start splitting it up. You make the problems for the computer smaller at a time, and also, we're not rendering all the elements in one go. It's like, one renders just the water, and then you just include in the render what the water really reflects and refracts. We would use camera clipping, so anything that is outside of the camera cone just gets deleted. And I understand that, there's instantly the question comes up, well, what about shadow casting from the outside? And yes, that is correct. You need to expect that, but a lot of times you don't see it actually. It makes a very little difference, especially if you have a chaotic shot like this. You can kind of, cheat a little bit. And so these are the elements. Or if you have like matte objects, they don't need to have or shadow casting object. They can be low resolution. So you can just you can have resolutions for shadow casting, have resolutions for reflections. Reflections in the water you're never going to see detail. So you can reduce even the texture size for the objects that reflect in the water. So you're really diving into every little problem, and you kind of try to give the computer a little bit more power here, a little bit more power here, a little bit more power here. And then combined, you suddenly gain a lot of room with memory, on the GPU. Everything was rendered on the GPU, by the way. So, we had to basically accommodate for that.
Yeah. I mean that knowing that when having to render with a GPU render like Redshift, obviously that seems to be a bottleneck, right? But I mean, otherwise, kind of what you're describing is breaking down the problem memory-wise and let's say CPU simulation or compute-wise, basically, it's still very similar to how these things were done 20 years ago, even though that computers got 100 times faster. It's just it looks a little bit better, but light linking and all of that stuff is still kind of the old school craftsmanship.
Yes.
Sweet. All right. That's been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for that. So what we're gonna do is just let's do a brief, let's say 7-minute-ish break. I'm gonna roll the video for that in a minute. Then we're just gonna basically briefly, or let me actually check how we're going to do that, in which order. So I'm just going to announce the stuff regarding the price sponsors. That doesn't take long. and then both you and Christian can come back, and we'll have the final panel discussion right after that.
Sounds good.
Sweet. All right.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thanks for doing this. Fantastic.